We will just begin this session and we will let other people join as their schedules permit. Welcome everybody who's here and will be viewing this in the future. I'm delighted to have a conversation with Jennifer Brown. And Jennifer, I want to just let you start off by introducing yourself.
Sure.
Who you are, what you do, and how you got to where you are right now.
Thank you, Glenn. Yeah, okay, I'll try to give the brief version of the winding road. I guess where I always start is to say I came to New York to be an opera singer, believe it or not, and it's where I still live. That was my dream. It got derailed, had some vocal trouble, had some surgeries, sadly, on my voice, and had to reinvent. And I luckily found my way to, as a performer, I found my way to a different stage, which is the stage that we think of when we think of training and development. So I became a soft skills trainer, which I don't love because they are real skills. They're serious skills. They're important skills.
You don't love the term, you mean?
Yeah, I don't love the term, but I love the skills. Exactly. And so I really cut my teeth in our leadership conversation, delivering hundreds of programs on so many different topics, and really just soaking up all that is broken in the workplace from many audiences, many clients, many companies, many geographies. And decided that, I'm not sure I meant to be a head of training and development or HR. I think I meant to be an independent voice so I can have full freedom to tell the truth, honestly, and, direct the conversation in the way I think it should be going, because I was developing my point of view around what I think is really not working in the workplace.
Right.
And then diversity and inclusion. So I started my own company, and it was leadership and team development. But the D&I piece came because eventually I'm LGBTQ, and I'd always been an activist in the workplace advocacy space, meaning all of my friends were leading these large company strategies in their spare time, of course, to approach the LGBT market and to approach that LGBT potential employee. And I had a front seat at a lot of the early days of that, 15, even 20 years ago. And I was very inspired. And I realized as my own company grew that I could actually specialize in diversity, equity, and inclusion. We didn't say equity at the time. We barely said inclusion at the time, actually. So that even that language has changed, and we can talk about that. And then I sort of pivoted the firm and started to build the team's expertise up in this specific space. And we've stayed in that niche. We've enjoyed it. I have a second book now out behind me, How to Be an Inclusive Leader. And I keynote all over the world. I talk to all kinds of audiences of all makeups, all identities. I bring my identity as an LGBTQ woman and a business owner, but I also bring my identity of a fair amount of privilege in my case in terms of how I grew up and the kind of voice that I can have. I bring that to my work as well. And I think a lot these days about allyship and even accomplishing, which is a fun and new word that some of us are using as a sort of a more concrete definition of allyship, I think. And
we'll do a deeper dive into that.
Yeah, let's do a deeper dive on that. I'm sure you have some meaty questions for me on that. So.
I just want to pause for a second for the benefit of people watching this. We get so used to throwing terms out, diversity and inclusion and equity. Can you just, for those who aren't enmeshed in this space, talk about the differences between diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, that's always the question that's asked and needed to be explained.
Absolutely.
I will quote Brene Myers. So this is not of my creation, but she says, diversity is being asked to the dance and inclusion is being asked to dance.
Right.
Right. So the diversity we could think of as the who is around the table, the both visible and invisible aspects of diversity, remember? So that makes it a little more complicated than just checking a box and saying, I have this many women, I have this many people of color. And then inclusion is really the how. So that's where the leadership piece becomes really interesting, because it's about behaviors and norms and speaking up and challenging things and suggesting new ways to be more inclusive. And then I might take it the third step and say belonging is a third word that's being added to the equation. And I define that as a result of the diversity that we bring, having felt truly included in every aspect and in ways that we define as included, in feeling included, results in a sense of belonging. And in that sense of belonging, then I think we can, if generated, we can retain more people. We can ensure that they not only stay, but they thrive, which are two different things.
Right.
And they really feel that even though I might be underrepresented or of a marginalized identity or identities, that I will be given a fair shot here. I'm supported to succeed. People see and hear me. I feel that I belong. And I think that's particularly challenging when you don't see yourself reflected in the ranks around you, above you, in a particular industry, et cetera. So belonging is really, I think, a goal. And it's also a very resonant word with younger talent in particular, because they're the generation, I think, that they're like diversity training. Why do we have to name that and call it out? And why is it a thing? And I mean, they feel sort of past that. And then they're coming into these workplaces that are very much not past that because we have major problems. So it's a very interesting generational difference too, in terms of the words that resonate. I was also going to say some of my clients have dropped diversity. They just refer to inclusion and belonging, or just belonging, or it may be inclusion and collaboration. I know one company that uses that. So there's also just this creativity that's happening with the words as well, depending on where the culture is in their journey.
So before we go into one of the key components that you and I have discussed in advance, and part of the theme of this is building allies, I want to touch and get your perspective on some of the trends that I am very encouraged by, but some that I'm really discouraged by in terms of the slow progress. And that's why I asked the question about diversity versus inclusion. And then when we talk about the sense of belonging, I'm in the Bay Area, we're sort of ground zero for all these innovations.
Yeah.
And yet there's hardly a week that goes by that there isn't something in the news about sexism, racism, elitism, something that, and you're drawing a lot of people you're drawing an audience, people are listening to this message. In your perspective, is it just a matter of time before let me rephrase that it takes a repeated messaging, takes multiple examples before it sinks in? Or am I just being a little more pessimistic and there really are these great changes going on?
Well, I know, I feel your pain. It depends on the day. Depends what dispiriting headline I've read that day too, because you're right. It's sort of, we're just pelted with, I think, bad news and things that look, we live in a more transparent business environment than we've ever been in, and things are coming out, which is great. Things that could be hidden in the past.
Right.
There are Slack channels now that get published, like the Away CEO who now has stepped down. There are messaging apps in the tech industry. I forget the name of it, but there's sort of these back channels that people talk on about what it's really like to work at Facebook, right, as a Black employee. And it's pretty depressing stuff, particularly the reactions from colleagues on some of these anonymous chat tools that are like, I don't even want to repeat some of the things that are said anonymously. So I think, look, companies can encourage us to be better humans. They can be a place, actually, if done well, that a more egalitarian, more equitable place can be created, through the right policies and practices and the right cultural norms and the right accountability. Because, by the way, you can set up everything, but if nobody practices it and nobody's held accountable for making it a consistent commitment over time, like, it doesn't stick, it doesn't matter. It's just window dressing, right? But I think, interestingly, companies are pulling society along in some ways, that they they are saying like, we want to be all about diversity and inclusion. So racist comments and jokes don't work here, and homophobia isn't tolerated, and we're going to hoist our pride flag. And, we know we're going to get hate mail, and we're going to do it anyway. And so there's some aspects where it just takes your breath away how significant these commitments are, or comments by CEOs, to various cultural celebrations or milestones or things in the news. But I think that the gap then is, though, what happens in the culture day to day, and how do we, if there is great commitment from the top, which often there is, believe it or not, it's really the middle that's the struggle.
Right.
They call it the frozen middle for a reason in the consulting world. It is a very difficult place. It's where change efforts go to die, as we say. And diversity and inclusion is one of those really difficult change efforts, because it brings up so much for people. So it requires actually expert change management, I think, and expert over communication and socialization, and also accountability. So people believe it when they hear it, that somebody's actually going to do something about it. I think that's where we still really have work to do. I think we just assume, tech is like notorious for this. We assume because we're sort of young and hip cultures, and we have like 5 kinds of kombucha, that we're like hip and inclusive because of our generation, or I don't know, because of our industry, or because of the tools we're building. Aren't they great? And, aren't they inclusive? But no, actually, there's a lot of people who are suffering, I would say, especially in tech. I don't know. I know more about banking and what it's doing with diversity and inclusion, and they've got some hardcore metrics going on. There is some serious infrastructure in some of the insurance companies I work with, some of the banks I work with. You'd be surprised. So I don't think we should always drink the Kool-Aid of who the cool kids think they are in terms of inclusion.
Right. Well, I appreciate your honesty on that, because I'm just going to share this observation that I've made, and I had this conversation with Willie Jackson, and
oh, I love Willie.
Prior to an interview, and I've moved since, but I live in a predominantly white, affluent liberal area, and I moved in the Bay Area from an extremely affluent area, and all over the place I would see these signs that say, we welcome people of all races, all religions, all genders. And I'm going, it's easy to say because everybody's white here. And what would be your attitude if people from a different ethnic culture moved next door to you and played a different type of music, and all of this kind of stuff? And rather than just harp on that, I want to ask you, what do you think are some of the keys in the work that you're doing with people, in bringing about more diversity and having it become the reality? There's the structural part. So we can get management and they can do the metrics, and there's still, to borrow a term from some of my history, there's the hearts and the minds. How do you win the hearts and the minds of people?
It's so tough. Well, the hearts and the minds. So, that is kind of a strategy in and of itself. Some people are very cerebral about this, intellectual. Some people are very sort of show me concrete things and concrete results. And so you have to make, I think, the business case argument to people that are won over via the head. And then there are those of us who can be won over with a powerful personal story. And exposure to difference, and generating that kind of empathy, human to human, that also, I think, can have a lasting impact on us and change ourselves. So hearts and minds indeed I think it speaks to the variety of tactics we need, and a variety of approaches, and how we need to really know our audience. I would never speak to, when I walk into a room full of executives, I'm so mindful that each of them is on their own journey and at a very different place, probably in their own maturity. And my new book actually has a 4-part model. And that was the reason I structured it that way, because I was thinking about, if I had my druthers, I don't have time, and it's not scalable to have one-on-one conversations with each person, given they're at a different place.
Right.
But if I could, here's a chapter for each. Here's what I think is going through their mind and heart. Here's what I would say to it, meeting the learner where they're at. And here's what I would give as kind of homework or next steps for a learner at that phase, knowing that there's a whole kind of variety of statuses within even one group. And so it's hard. I mean, this work is hard to scale for exactly this reason. This is why unconscious bias training for everyone is
Mhm.
not really effective, because, each person has their own hangups, their own preconceived notions, their own stereotypes. Some people are super into this and they just need to know more about the how. Some people have been doing this forever and are very actually adept at it and need to know sort of, how do I even up my game even more?
Right.
And so those are like three completely different conversations. So yeah, I think that we've got to really think about our audience when we talk and teach about these things. And my hope is that wherever you are as a learner, you know where you are. That's really important. And then that you tackle your next steps from there, and that you sort of enlist people strategically to hold the space for you as you figure it out and find new language and step forward into potential allyship. Because it's not a solo sport. This stuff requires other people to not only learn from, but to, support you, give you honest feedback when you really need it,
Right.
and encourage people too, because I do think this is a hard journey to get started on, particularly if you're a person of a lot more privileges than not. Also hard for white men to embark on the journey. And that was another reason the book, I really wanted to write a book no matter what, that spoke to that coalition, because that's
Mhm.
an incredibly important group to have involved in this. And I think traditionally they really haven't been, because lots of reasons, but mainly I think it's because they just don't know how to get involved.
Or I might even add why they should get involved.
Yeah, how and why.
Often.
Yes.
So let's go into that a little bit about your developing allies. There is, as a white male, it's easy for me to say there's a kind of conundrum that I've observed with women claiming more authority and power and transforming the workplaces. Um, in that, traditionally, either there has to be this separation. We're going to start this all woman firm,
Yes.
or we're going to have to fight, which has to be exhausting for a lot of people because they just want to go to work. They don't want to be activists, and yet they want to be respected. They want to be included. They want to belong. Um, because what really part of what has to change is the white male dominant mindset. And it's one of these, back to the question of why should people change? And my own thinking about that has evolved over time. So tell me about this building this ally, and because I think whatever action people take, there's always pushback.
Yeah, true. Oh
And,
yeah, and white men stepping forward and challenging, a homophobic joke will get you uninvited to the golf course on Saturday.
or a or a
Will cause you to be a pariah.
right, or a sexist joke, same thing.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, oh
we're all
totally.
just friends here. What's the problem?
Right. Why are you making such a big deal about it? Like, so what you're doing if you challenge that with your allyship is you're stepping outside of what Mark Green and Tony Porter actually calls the man box. And you're stepping outside of these norms that, you're right, the workplace has been built around this. I mean, is literally entrenched in the system that we all labor in every day. I mean, and that's, I think, deep down, I didn't know at the time, but honestly, that was why I escaped.
Mhm.
I just knew it was not going to be good for me. I didn't really have the language for it, but I just knew it. And it's not good for a lot of people. And it's frankly not good for men either, because we don't speak at all. And we're not talking about the diversity amongst men. There is a tremendous, not every guy is toxically masculine. And yet those are the loudest voices. Perhaps that is how power has been used and abused.
Mhm.
And men who are different in any way have felt silenced by the strength of this sort of overwhelming culture, and these norms that we all know. I mean, ask any woman, we know, but I'm not sure we understand or have empathy for or compassion for
Right.
how unhealthy and toxic it's been for many men as well. So I do think there's a learning gap there that we could invest more in, and I think that would help kind of push the conversation to say, well, wait a second, what would a healthy inclusive culture look like if we were to dismantle it. The problem is we won't have the luxury of dismantling things. Like we have to always work at this incremental way. And it's something that haunts me because I am like, gosh, I just feel like I'm kind of dancing along the surface with our work, when I know that the very structure may be the problem, right? So we're putting lipstick on, but but are we really addressing the inequities that have been baked into like literally business as usual, the DNA of most organizations? And by the way, you've got in the Away case, you've got 2 female CEOs and you've got complaints of a toxic culture. So, and I'm not saying that's the whole story. It's all I can glean from the media, but I'm just saying it's not necessarily who's building it. It's big, like you keep saying, it's bigger than that. It's actually, it's all the behaviors that we associate with business and capitalism, and the way that this has been done. And women adopt it, we perfect it, we perpetuate it. In some cases, we can live it in a really toxic way too. So anyway, I just think it's really interesting. I mean, I have to say, I am a believer though in needing more representation for diverse faces and experiences at the top of the house. I mean, that is like a must for me. So I'm not saying at all that won't make a difference. I'm just saying that it is all around us. It's the water we swim in. So your question is, how do we tackle that and not in an incremental way?
And so how do you reach out to when we had our first conversation, you were talking about enlisting men as allies. Mm-hmm. How do you do that? And how can people listening to this, if they want to learn from your experiences?
Yeah. Oh, I love that conversation.
Lessons here and some pieces of wisdom you can impart here?
Yeah, I would say, I've been going to some conferences that are focused on men as allies. Yes, they exist. There's one called the Better Man Conference, bettermanconference.com. Mm-hmm. We ran it 3 times. I say we because I'm kind of in a partnership with Ray Arata, who runs Better Man Conference, and the team. And we put the content together, and I speak on that stage as well. So those run in the fall, and they're full of 200 to 300 male allies in training, aspiring allies, as we like to say, because you're only an ally if somebody in an affected group calls you an ally. So it's not a destination, it's a journey. And there are people in those rooms that have made real time to buckle down and to ask questions that are uncomfortable and figure out, like, what am I going to do when I get back to the workplace? What am I going to do differently? What kind of conversations am I going to have? What am I going to challenge? Who am I going to sponsor and mentor? And all of that is fair game in the room. And it's great. And we have some women in the room too, and they're usually incredibly bright women who are really calling the questions. Mm-hmm. But they're dedicated, and I love it. And so am I. So it's that piece is happening. There are also men as allies, employee resource groups popping up in corporations. Mm-hmm. So, and some of those actually come as a group to the Better Man Conference to learn together, which is cool. So that's a sort of important core experience for them. Nike has a Men as Allies group. The Gates Foundation has one. I think Moody's has one. Unilever has one. So
explain to me a little bit about what these groups, how they operate.
Yeah. So they are affinity groups. They are like the Women's Network or the Black Employee Network or LGBTQ Network. They aren't, though. Usually they're not as formally sanctioned as that. They're blessed, but they're not maybe funded. I mean, they're brand new. And I think they're a little under the radar screen is my sense. Right. So they aren't sort of, trumpeted from, the comms team, if you will. I think that because we're still trying to, get the model right. And I think there's also pushback. A lot of people are like, why do men need a group? The world is their group. That's not fair. And so it has to be very, very carefully managed and communicated about and socialized. And I think that's why these groups are a bit under the radar screen, although I think they're coming out more and more. And they're working on things like our own racial learning. We're learning about whiteness in particular, because a lot of these groups are dominated by white men in particular, but also intersectionality amongst men. So, the smart ones are constructing their steering committees that in an intersectional way, making sure that everybody's at the table, including queer identified men as well. And then they're working on that education piece, the awareness piece. And I would say also things like parental leave. So the question of what are best practices for men to take leave, and why don't they take that leave? Because they don't. I mean, there's really interesting statistics that it's so stigmatized still that, it's something we don't talk about. It's certainly something men don't talk about. And the bigger conversation, of course, is normalizing male parenting, the want to be a parent, the fact that I am dedicated to my career and I prioritize my family, and I'm not going to make up lies about where I am on a conference call when really I'm going home because I miss my kids. It's a lot of the stuff actually we women have been talking about for a very long time, but it's really cool to start to chip away at the conversation about men as parents and who are they? What do they want? Do they feel comfortable here? Why not?
Make a connection for me. I mean, all of that liberates men to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
But how does it build on inclusion? How does it lend itself to creating workplaces that operate differently than the old paradigms?
Well, I think it fills in a blank that we've had, which is that we've been investing and counting on education from women and people of color and other underrepresented groups to do all of this heavy lifting. And then not to pick on white men, but I think that we've left out these big constituencies from the conversation in terms of, well, what can you do? And what's your involvement in this? And what's your interest in this? And what would be your why? And we haven't done a good job of that. And so I think progress has been limited, because if you leave out the group that is the most dominant in leadership positions and has the disproportionate amount of power and access, and they completely have no idea how to get involved with something besides just go to, unconscious bias training once a year, we're going to fail. And so, I mean, to me, it's very clear. And also, I'm very tired of doing all the heavy lifting. I think there's a lot of people who are carrying a lot of water and pouring that water into the organization on a volunteer basis, educating and being there and mentoring and reverse mentoring and being in the ERGs and trying to lift everybody up. But we're playing the game with half the team. And the half of the team we're playing with, I don't know, like we're kind of a motley crew.
Most of the cards.
Yeah, exactly. Most of the cards are not on the field. So I'm trying to get people on the field. And my argument is that with not even a lot of effort, there are ways to step into the opportunities of allyship that are fairly small that could have a very large impact and save somebody what might take somebody in a marginalized identity 10 years to do would take you like one conversation to do. And literally, like, those examples are everywhere. I have, and that's what I tell diverse talent. I say, like, you must work smarter, not harder. You are working harder right now. Like, we're all trying to, have you seen that meme of the woman with a broom on the beach and she's running up and down the beach, like trying to sweep the water back into the ocean?
No, I haven't seen it. It's a great image.
It's just so perfect. And it's how so many of us feel. And right. We are so burned out and so tired of not being heard and not having the power to enact change. And so this is what I'm sitting with. I mean, I just don't even feel like we have a choice. So when you say, so what does this have to do with inclusiveness? What we need to do is normalize more people, unexpected voices talking about this topic. People that look like the straight white guy that you have no idea what his story is. You have no idea what he knows about diversity because he's never shared. And, because he's never made the connection to his own background and his own experiences of exclusion. And he's only thought about gender as diversity as a gender and ethnicity thing. But it's like so much broad. I mean, there's literally, I put up on my screen, there's like 30 dimensions of diversity about us. Mental health, veteran status, criminal background, non-traditional education, true gender identity, cultural beliefs, values, politics, sober and in recovery, growing up incredibly poor and in an abusive household. I mean, it just goes on and on. So opening this up, I think, will invite people to see themselves in the conversation about inclusion, exclusion. And what I really would like is more people that you wouldn't expect being vulnerable, bringing their full selves to work, sharing those things, and normalizing the sharing of it, the normalizing the not hiding. Because a lot of us are doing that work. We're coming to work. We're trying to bring our full selves to work. We're taking those leaps of faith in terms of honoring what we need and want, and we still might get penalized for it,
Yes.
right? Because we're already in a marginalized group, and then it just makes us look like, it just reminds everybody around us of like our identities and our struggle and my gender and my sexual orientation and whatever. So it's just, to me, the people at most risk are taking the most risk. And that it's not fair. And it's not a sustainable plan for change.
Right. Well, I think that's the key, is that it's not sustainable. And there are just so many public examples of when people have done that, how they tend to get more marginalized.
Right.
And more pushed to the side of,
they're troublemakers, right?
Or, well, what do you expect?
Yeah.
Something like that. So, from listening to you talk and from my background in psychology, it sounds like a huge piece of this is that as people are more secure in themselves, they can allow everybody else to be more of themselves. They're no longer being threatened by somebody that's different or somebody that's challenging their point of view. And so part of this is helping those in positions of authority and influence to just be more real themselves. And as they own that, then they can extend that generosity to other people.
And they will set a different tone and make it safe to do that. Because I think that's the executives of anybody, executive level, is sort of that, have to be unassailable, perfect, have all the answers, never appear uncertain. And this work we're talking about is certainly, it's very uncertain. It's very vulnerable. You don't know where it's going to go. You don't know the impact it's going to have. You can scarcely make up something that's more terrifying to a senior leader, right? Who has a visible role. Right. And yet I would argue that those folks are the safest. They are the safest in terms of job security and pay and economically, like what can really be taken away from them. Lots can be taken away from me. I can still lose my job for being LGBTQ in nearly 30 states. There's no protections. So when I come out, it is a radical act. True. And not because for me, it's easy to do that because I'm protected by many other privileges, right? Not so radical for me, very radical for other people in my community, which I'm always mindful of. But I would argue for execs, like if you're not uncomfortable every day, you're not leading, you're not growing. And this is one area where, we can't all just be fans of Brene Brown and think she's the greatest and then like not walk the talk in terms of vulnerability, like as a leadership competency. And it's honestly what younger generations really want to see in a leader. They want to see the whole leader. They want to see the real leader. I think that transparency age we live in means that we can't kind of show this facade that's incomplete about ourselves all the time and expect people to be really motivated to follow us. Because remember, this generation is the one that cares the least about seniority and is impressed the least about the fancy title and really wants the meeting with the CEO tomorrow because they have some great ideas to share, So what's going to make them like respect you if they're not going to buy the title automatically and say, oh, well, they know best and they're a big deal? Like, no. And I never think it should have been that easy anyway.
Mm-hmm. I want you to repeat something, or I'm going to repeat something you just said, because I think this is such a key, such a jewel, and you went over it really quickly, which is if you are not uncomfortable every day, then you're not leading.
Yeah.
And I just want to sit with that for a second and ask you to just articulate about your thinking about the connection between leadership and being uncomfortable.
And inclusion.
So
what's interesting to me is business leaders are uncomfortable often around a variety of, there's so much new stuff that we've got to accomplish every day, right? And we don't know exactly how we're going to do it. We get a team together, we figure it out, whatever. And then we pat ourselves on the back and we say, go team, we're going to do this. And we probably are uncomfortable. The weird thing is that people expect the work of diversity and inclusion not to be uncomfortable when it's literally another business skill.
Mhm.
It's like literally like,
Well, I would argue it's
I don't know.
more than a business skill. I think it really touches on some much deeper core. I mean, I'm just going to name a few of them. When we talk about certainly with gender inclusion, I mean, it touches on sexuality. It touches on our own, for a man, our own sense of masculinity. It touches on all of, and I can tell you again, from my history as a psychologist, it touches on all of our motherhood issues. And
Oh, the
I
mother
mean,
wound. Yeah.
and as human beings, we're really good at just, let's just suppress that and move ahead. And
Yeah, we
so when
are.
all of this stuff comes up, it's like we're not just touching one skill. It's not like I'm teaching you how to read a spreadsheet or I'm teaching you how to use, Excel or something like that. It's like this is, and I think that's part of the reason why there's so much pushback
Yeah. Yeah,
because
no, you're right. You're right. No, it is. It's personal. And we haven't really mixed business and personal, I guess, right? We have, and I think that is part of, back to your point about like what's kind of broken in the workplace culture as it's been built. It's been very disembodied, I think, from who people are.
Mhm.
And therefore, we feel this need to cover and suppress all these things that we think don't exist around us, but really do, by the way. Somebody could be having a very similar experience as we are, but since nobody's talking about it, it's assumed. We feel alone. We feel not supported. The company doesn't know that we're struggling. And if it does, it doesn't know what to do or thinks it's an isolated case. So the problem is it's a contagion of covering that is, we're all participating in sort of a lack of telling the truth about what's really going on for us. And um, so we can't get where we need to go with healthy cultures if we aren't kind of advocating, and it's not just alone advocating, but it's hopefully as a group advocating. But if we can't see ourselves and find each other, how can we have a critical mass to speak? It reminds me a bit of, well, LGBT people have an impossible time finding each other. Allies have an impossible time finding each other. And I'm often asked, well, how do I find a community? Like, where are we? And it's a great question. We're all around, but we have no mechanism to locate each other. But when we do, it's tremendously incredible to feel seen and heard, to feel you find somebody familiar and along the same path and journey and with the same commitments and values as you have. And then you can decide, how do we want to use our voice, so that one of us doesn't get called out. It's kind of like whack-a-mole. If you've got a lot of heads popping up,
Right.
There's no way they can hurt one of us if there's a bunch of us. So I do think that's true for like mental health. I'm thinking of something that is deeply, deeply stigmatized. I think we're going to be sitting here 5 years from now, and that's going to be something that courageous people have decided, I'm going to bring my full self to work and I'm going to talk about being bipolar. And I'm also a woman of color, right? So I am literally dealing with like, what do I bring? What do people need to know about me? What's deeply stigmatized, and how am I parsing that out? I don't want people to be struggling so much with that. So how do we fix that? Because that's impacting her productivity. It's impacting her relationships with others. And I'm thinking of one like literal example. And she shared this with me and I was so humbled. And I just thought, she's brilliant. She's talented. And she's struggling with all this stuff and thinks that the company won't get it. Her coworkers won't get it. And nobody can support her. And she has no idea like who else might be struggling with it. So it's really not right. I think we'll look back years from now and say, wow, that was really unhealthy. But at the same time, there's really amazing things going on in workplaces of celebration of difference that are super cool. I mean, I think the way the LGBT community has literally used the corporate space to create 100% companies on the Corporate Equality Index, which is something that our community uses to ensure LGBT-friendly workplaces and employers. And there's hundreds now of 100% companies that are literally waiting with bated breath for the next criteria to come out so they can go after it, and achieve another 100% or keep that 100%. And it's incredible to be listened to as a community like that, and see these massive institutions shaping themselves around how we define inclusion, LGBT inclusion. So actually, I mean, I don't mean to like bag on companies. I mean, I think corporate America has a tremendous power for social change. and needs to step forward, because God knows other realms are not doing anything in that sphere. Quite the opposite these days.
So let's get in the weeds for a moment on some concrete. If back to this idea of allies, people are asking you, how can I find allies? And what are some of the suggestions? And I'm going to give you a couple scenarios and then answer it however you want. So
sure.
The stereotypical case of women being disrespected in the workplace is if they speak up, they risk getting fired. Mm-hmm. But they're not comfortable with certain things that are going on. They like their job. They need to pay their bills. And, quitting looks bad on their resume. All of this stuff. What are some steps you might suggest? Should they go find a white male ally? Should they go look for people having other experiences? What might you suggest to people in those types of situations?
Yeah, I think suffering alone is never good. So if you can find your people, so this is why affinity groups exist, honestly. The very kind of first or second goal of them was to provide a safe space to be honest about what's going on. And these are really, really important spaces for many people who are really struggling with backlash to their authenticity every day. Right. So the microaggressions, stereotypes, not, seeing anyone that looks like you on a day-to-day basis, it's very, very hard work. And so to be together, to commiserate, to compare notes about solutions, it's not just a complaining place. It's a productive place. These groups can really be spaces where you decide, like, okay, so if we have a collective voice, what are the things that we want to really advocate for that would make the most difference? Now, how do we want to guide our company to make a better workplace so that we don't have to have these conversations as much, right? So that's, and it doesn't always play out this way. Mm-hmm. Some companies, groups are more social in nature and not so much guiding, like not having a seat at the table and guiding the company. But that's the role I'd like to see them have. And I've done a ton of consulting work in that space to kind of push that understanding of our value, that, we are a sounding board for our companies. If they don't retain us and we're unhappy and we have one foot out the door, that is bad news for the company for the future. It's bad news for the company's ability to attract and retain people from our community. So,
So these affiliation groups you're talking about presumably are large organizations. I don't know that I have my statistics right, but
yeah,
something like 90% of businesses are 50 people or less.
Yeah.
Let's talk about those types of organizations. I think the big companies have enough voices now active that they can get steered and people within them can get steered. But all of the smaller companies, are there affiliations that you know of, online type resources or ways people can? I mean, for me, the first step, and I think you've mentioned this, is just validation that you're not, that what you're experiencing, you have the right to experience, and it's not about you.
And by the way, get your anger out in a safe place.
Right.
Like vent your frustration in a place that's most productive for you to do that, and then make a plan, like get that out and then make a strategic plan to approach, think it through, like, how am I going to address what just happened in the meeting I was in, for example. And that's, I think, just to wrap up your question about allyship, yes to working smarter, not harder means not always being the voice that's doing the challenging. Mm-hmm. So working smarter means that you've invested in relationships with allies who, by the way, I know from the ally side, I think people are asking, how can I do more? What can I do to help others? How do I know there's a problem? I'm ready to be activated. There's so many people that are like, tell me and I'll do something. Like, what do I need to do? So there's literally this mismatch we're living in until we kind of get these puzzle pieces together. Somebody with power that can challenge something so that you don't have to. Somebody who can have a conversation, somebody who can follow up, somebody who can have your back in the next meeting so that somebody doesn't steal your idea or talk over you or interrupt you all the time or address their remarks to the man in the room and not to you. We all have the ability to do little things that really shift these dynamics. So I would say we need to invest in those ally relationships and make asks, be really specific. Hey, I feel like I'm never heard in this meeting. Or I'm asked to take the notes all the time.
Right.
And I don't feel comfortable being the one that's like, it's really sexist for me to be taking the notes every time. Like, could somebody else do it? I may not be in the position to bring that up. So, but a man may be, and it wouldn't be of any cost to him to bring that up. So yes, activating your allies is critical. To your question of small companies, yes, there's not a critical mass in a smaller company to have multiple identity-based affinity groups. You can, though, have a working steering committee or council of interested people who want to make sure that as you grow from 20 people to 50 people to 100 people to 5,000 people, that you're monitoring the culture for inclusiveness, and that there is some level of watchdog going on where there is a group of people who are coming together consistently, talking about some issues, surfacing issues, making sure voices are heard, because what you do in the beginning gets magnified as the company grows. And so if you don't set your compass in the right way, it's like artificial intelligence and bias in
Yes.
AI, right? We build it in because we don't know we're building it in because we don't have diversity on the design teams.
Right.
And then it goes out and literally fills our world with bias, like fills it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's terrifying when you think about it. And, Adam Pizzoni is a member of the responsive community. I had him on my podcast, and he told me that he refused to interview any white men for his new startup when he was creating the founding team, because he said, it made me realize my entire network is men. Right. And that if I just open the floodgates in the interview process, everyone that's going to come to me is going to look like me. And if I hire them, then I'm never going to get any other talent that's going to want to come work here. I'm never going to be able to serve a diverse world, which in his case with his new startup is the world of education and educational institutions. So teachers, administrators, students. And it's a radical solution, but I approve because this is not something you can tackle sort of when you have time. It's not particularly for small companies that are going to grow. This is not an incremental commitment. It needs to be pasted on the walls from day one. There needs to be a conversation about it. I mean, God knows, like read a book a month, have a book club, like discuss it, make sure the senior people are in that room. My book has been in many book clubs in small companies, and they're crashing around the ideas. They're thinking about, well, what would this look like for us? Where are we sourcing our talent? Where's their bias in our interviewing process? They're asking all the right questions. So it's just the form that it takes might be different. Right. But I think it absolutely can be done, and it has to be done. Okay. Yeah.
So I want to go to the ally side of this equation for a moment. You've had people, you've heard conversations where allies are going, what can we do? to the men who are listening to this that would like to be more supportive and more proactive. Mm. I want to ask you about a very common experience that many, many men, if not every man I know, experiences, which is off-colored humor. Mm. Somebody making comments about somebody's breast, about their physicality, about their color. And back to something we touched on earlier about if you're the boss, then it's easy to say that's totally inappropriate and we're not going to have that conversation. But if you're not the boss and you're vulnerable, what are some thoughts you have about how to, Gillette did this beautiful set of advertisements.
Oh, I love that ad.
Toxic masculinity, yes. And they showed some examples.
They did.
But what else can men do? What stories have you heard about how men have handled some of this? That, and what other ways can men get involved in a healthy way, in a proactive?
Well, I think the same stuff applies that we were just talking about, which is, first of all, find your community. I think awareness and solidarity and community is the first step to saying, am I crazy? Like, am I the only one that thinks that's wrong? Like, how do I broach that? And that's literally, I think, what these Men as Allies groups are, a safe, closed door space to talk about that. like literally say, I overheard this. I didn't know what to say, or I said this and now this happened as a consequence. Like, what do I do now? And I didn't get that assignment, or I wasn't picked for that client gig.
Right.
I mean, there's real repercussions. I mean, I feel like saying like, welcome to our world.
Right.
It sucks, doesn't it? It really does. Anyway, so I think you, first of all, like, be resilient about it. There's many people who deal with this on a day-to-day basis. And so when you do it for the first time, it's going to feel really hard. Like when you step out of that man box, when you sort of challenge it, or you even just deciding that you're not okay with something is the first step, even if it takes you a long time to say something about it. But find that community that believes similarly as you, that's not tolerable, and brainstorm with that community about creative things you can do to address it. I'm a fan of, feedback in private, like, really think carefully about like how and when and in front of whom you want to have conversations, where you say, hey, some folks might be uncomfortable when you make jokes like that. I think too, acquainting yourself with the experience, the everyday experience of people of more marginalized identities actually fuels your fire. It gives you a lot more concrete data. It equips you for conversation. So if somebody says, oh, that's no big deal, we've always done that, or whatever, we've always had that, meeting with that client at a sports bar, like, what's your problem? Right. You need to actually be able to double click into that answer and say why it's a problem. And the only way you're going to learn that, unless you're super smart and you're pretty woke and you're paying attention, is by kind of having, sitting in on rooms where maybe the Women's Network's having a panel and, you're showing up because you're trying to learn, so that you have context, so that you have examples, so that you have reasons why, so that you have, if you really want to get fancy, you should always be able to bring every point back to a business case, because that's what people listen to. So if you can say to someone that joke makes certain people you know what I mean? Like, just argue the case. Like, think about how you would construct it.
Okay. That's very helpful. So unfortunately, we have run out of
oh, but so fast.
Far away from running out of topics. This is wonderful. How do people get a hold of you, Jennifer, if they want to learn more or bring you on board, or just contact you or something of that nature? What's the best way for people to reach you?
Thank you. Buy the book. This is the second book, How to Be an Inclusive Leader.
For those who can't, just say that louder, because for that's far away for some of us who don't have great eyesight. How to be an inclusive leader.
How to Be an Inclusive Leader. This is the book number 2. I also have a first book called Inclusion. So if you really are into this one and you want more, you can go back and read the first one. They're both available in audiobook and ebook too. And I have a podcast called The Will to Change. And, when you ask, like, what can allies do? They can listen to podcasts like mine. I mean, or any other podcasts that aren't produced by or about people that look like you. That's the goal. Okay. So all my guests, very, very few of them are white cisgendered women. And in fact, my bar is probably the highest on them getting through. They have to be really extraordinary. Or unusual, and a voice that I haven't had on the podcast. So one of the things you can do is diversify the media that you consume and make that kind of a steady diet and a very intentional diet. Okay. I'm in social media at Jennifer Brown on Twitter, at Jennifer Brown Speaks on Instagram, and on LinkedIn and Facebook, Jennifer Brown Consulting. And if you're in an organization that needs some consulting support, either training or education, please reach out to us at info@jenniferbrownconsulting.com. And we will get back to you and see what we might be able to do. Oh, thank you, Glenn.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for participating, and hope we cross paths sooner rather than later.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for the conversation.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.